Your future self does not believe you anymore. And maybe that sounds harsh, but think about it. How many times have you said, tomorrow? How many times have you promised yourself that this time would be different? How many times have you felt that sudden wave of clarity at night, when everything seems obvious, when you know exactly what you need to change, when you feel almost ashamed of how long you have delayed it? And then morning comes, the same phone, the same routine, the same excuses, the same emotional fog, the same negotiation with yourself. And the person you said you were becoming disappears again, not forever, just for one more day. And that is how self-trust dies. Not in one dramatic collapse, not in one huge failure, not because you made one mistake. Self-trust dies quietly, one broken promise at a time, one postponed decision at a time, one not today at a time, one moment where you knew what you had to do and still chose the old pattern. At first, it does not feel serious. You tell yourself it was just one day, just one delay, just one mistake. Just one bad night, just one excuse. But something inside you is always listening. Something inside you is keeping record, not with cruelty, with memory. And after enough broken promises, your mind starts to learn something painful. It learns that your words are not always safe. It learns that your plans may not mean much. It learns that your excitement is temporary. It learns that your decisions disappear when discomfort arrives. And then you wonder why you do not feel confident. But confidence is not something you magically wake up with. Confidence is not a personality trait. Confidence is not a phrase you repeat in the mirror. Confidence is evidence. Evidence that you do what you say. Evidence that you return after failure. Evidence that you can face discomfort without surrendering immediately. Evidence that you are not just someone who talks about change, but someone who can be trusted with change. That is why motivation never lasts when self-trust is broken. Motivation can make you feel alive for a moment. Motivation can make the future look close. Motivation can make you imagine a stronger version of yourself. But motivation cannot erase the evidence you have been giving yourself for years. If the evidence says, "I always abandon," your mind will not believe a motivational sentence for very long. It will feel good for a few minutes, maybe for a few hours, maybe even for a day. But then the old memory returns. The memory of every time you said you would start and did not. Every time you said you would stop and returned. Every time you said you were serious and then acted like nothing mattered. That memory becomes stronger than the speech. So the real work is not to feel motivated. The real work is to become believable to yourself again. That is a very different goal, because most people keep trying to become a new person before they have repaired their relationship with their own word. They want the big transformation, the perfect routine, the disciplined identity, the body, the money, the project, the peace, the confidence, the new life. But they are trying to build it on top of a broken internal contract. And a broken internal contract makes everything heavier. You start a goal, but part of you already doubts you. You make a plan, but part of you expects you to quit. You imagine the result, but part of you remembers how many times you disappeared before. That is why starting again can feel embarrassing, even when nobody knows. Because you know. You know how many times you have said the same thing. You know how many plans were born with intensity and died in silence. You know how many notebooks, apps, promises, routines, and new eras never became anything. And the painful part is not only that you failed. The painful part is that you saw yourself fail yourself again and again and again. That changes the way you see yourself, not because you are weak, not because you are hopeless, but because trust responds to evidence. If someone else promised you something 10 times and broke it 10 times, you would stop believing them, even if you still loved them, even if you wanted to believe them, even if they sounded sincere every time. At some point, you would stop listening to their promises and start watching their behavior. Your mind does the same thing with you. It does not care how emotional you sounded when you promised. It watches what you do when the emotion fades. It watches what you do when the day becomes inconvenient. It watches what you do when nobody is there to praise you. It watches what you do when the old escape is available. It watches what you do when the first obstacle arrives. And then it decides whether your word has weight. That is why the first goal is not greatness. The first goal is credibility. Become credible to yourself. Before you try to become impressive, before you try to rebuild your entire life, before you try to prove anything to anyone, become someone your own mind can believe. Because if you cannot believe yourself, every goal will feel unstable. You will need constant motivation, constant reminders, constant pressure, constant emotional intensity, constant external validation. You will need someone else to push you because your own word does not move you anymore. And that is a dangerous way to live, because the world will not always push you. People will not always remind you. Motivation will not always visit you. Fear will not always be loud enough to move you. Sometimes it will be a normal day. Quiet, ordinary, no drama, no crisis, no inspiring music, no one watching. And on that kind of day, your future is decided more than you think. Not by a huge decision, by the small moment where you either keep your word or teach yourself that your word can be ignored again. This is why small promises matter. People underestimate them because they are not glamorous. They want big commitments, big declarations, big transformations. But big declarations are easy. A small promise kept on a tired day is harder. A small promise kept when no one sees is harder. A small promise kept after a failure is harder. A small promise kept without emotional reward is harder. And that is exactly why it rebuilds you, because your mind does not need another performance. It needs proof. Proof that you can tell yourself the truth. Proof that you can do one thing, even when the old pattern is available. Proof that you can return without turning failure into a funeral. Proof that your future can trust you with something small. That is where the repair begins. Not with an extreme routine. Not with punishing yourself. Not with hating the version of you that failed. Not with trying to become perfect overnight. With one kept promise. Then another. Then another. Small enough to repeat. Serious enough to matter. Because if the promise is too big, you may only be performing for your emotions. But if the promise is small and real, you can actually build evidence. And evidence is what changes identity, not inspiration, not fantasy. Evidence. This is the part most people do not understand. They think identity changes when they feel different. But often, identity changes after they act differently long enough to believe it. You do not wake up disciplined. You collect disciplined decisions. You do not wake up confident. You collect moments where you did not abandon yourself. You do not wake up focused. You collect proof that your attention can stay where you place it. You do not wake up strong. You collect evidence that discomfort does not own you. That is the quiet path, and it is not exciting at the beginning. In fact, it may feel disappointing, because the first real step often looks too small for the size of the life you want. You want transformation, but the first step is going to sleep earlier. You want freedom. But the first step is tracking your money honestly. You want confidence. But the first step is keeping one private promise. You want a new identity. But the first step is not returning to one old excuse today. The ego hates that. The ego wants something dramatic. It wants a scene. It wants a comeback story. It wants a moment where everything changes. But the mind rebuilds trust through repetition, not drama. And repetition is humble. Repetition does not care about your image. Repetition does not care if it looks impressive. Repetition asks only one question. Will you return? That is the question. Not, will you feel ready? Not, will you be perfect? Not, will everyone understand? Not, will this be easy? Will you return? After the bad day. After the missed workout. After the wasted morning. After the emotional relapse. After the impulse purchase. After the failed attempt. After the awkward beginning. After the moment where the old version of you wins again. Will you return? Because the strongest people are not the ones who never fall. They are the ones who stop making a home out of the fall. That line matters. Some people do not fail and recover. They fail and move in. They decorate the failure. They create an identity around it. They say, this is what always happens to me. They say, I knew I couldn't do it. They say, this proves I am not that kind of person. And then one mistake becomes permission to disappear for weeks, months, sometimes years. But a mistake is not a command. A mistake is not a life sentence. A mistake is not proof that the old identity is the truth. A mistake is information. It tells you where the system was weak. It tells you what trigger was stronger than expected. It tells you what time of day is dangerous. It tells you what emotion makes you negotiate. It tells you what promise was too vague. It tells you what support you need. It tells you where your honesty failed, but it only helps you if you return. If you disappear, the mistake becomes another monument to self-abandonment. If you return, the mistake becomes training. That is one of the deepest differences between people who change and people who stay trapped. Not that one group fails and the other does not. Everyone fails. The difference is how long they remain loyal to the failure. Some people fail and build an excuse. Others fail and build a system. Some people fail and attack themselves. Others fail and study the pattern. Some people fail and say, this is who I am. Others fail and say, "This is where I need proof." That is the shift. Do not ask, "Why am I like this?" forever. Ask, "What evidence would start changing this?" Because identity does not change through endless self-analysis. At some point, analysis must become evidence. You can understand your patterns and still repeat them. You can know your triggers and still obey them. You can explain your wounds and still let them drive. You can recognize your excuses and still protect them. Understanding is important, but understanding without action becomes a more intelligent prison. Now, you can describe the cage perfectly, but you are still inside it. That is why the question has to become practical. Where do I need proof? If you do not trust yourself with discipline, proof may be one completed action a day. If you do not trust yourself with money, proof may be writing down every expense for 1 week. If you do not trust yourself with focus, proof may be 20 minutes without interruption. If you do not trust yourself with boundaries, proof may be one honest no. If you do not trust yourself after failure, proof may be returning the same day instead of waiting for Monday. Proof does not need to be huge. It needs to be undeniable. That is what rebuilds the internal contract. One undeniable action, small but real. Because your mind can argue with intentions. It can argue with plans. It can argue with fantasies. But it has a harder time arguing with evidence. You said you would do it. You did it. That is evidence. You failed. You returned. That is evidence. You felt fear. You still acted. That is evidence. You wanted to escape. You stayed present. That is evidence. You were tempted to break your word. You kept it. That is evidence. And over time, evidence becomes identity. Not because you forced yourself to believe, because you gave your mind something to remember. That is how self-trust comes back. Quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly at first. Then one day you notice something. You no longer need to negotiate as much. You no longer need to convince yourself for an hour. You no longer feel like every good decision is a war. You no longer see discipline as a costume. You start to feel a quiet seriousness inside you. Not arrogance, seriousness. The sense that your life is no longer just a place where impulses come and go. It is something you are responsible for. And responsibility, when you stop treating it as punishment, becomes freedom. Because a person who has no responsibility over themselves is not free. They may do whatever they feel like doing. But that is not freedom if every impulse controls them. If you cannot stop scrolling, are you free? If you cannot stop spending when you are anxious, are you free? If you cannot leave a conversation that destroys your peace, are you free? If you cannot keep one promise to yourself, are you free? If every emotion becomes an order, are you free? Freedom is not doing whatever impulse appears. Freedom is being able to choose even when the impulse is loud. And that requires self-trust. Because if you do not trust yourself, you become easy to control. By moods, by people, by algorithms, by fear, by comfort, by approval, by the version of you that wants relief now and does not care about the future. That version will always exist. Do not expect it to disappear completely. The goal is not to kill every weak impulse. The goal is to stop letting every weak impulse become government. There is a difference. You can feel the old impulse and not obey it. You can feel the fear and not hand it the wheel. You can feel the desire to escape and still stay. You can feel the shame after failure and still return. That is self-governance, not perfection. Self-governance. And it may be one of the most important skills in a world designed to fragment you. Because everything is trying to get a piece of your attention. Your phone wants it. Advertising wants it. Entertainment wants it. Other people's drama wants it. Old wounds want it. Comparison wants it. Anxiety wants it. Your future also needs it. But your future cannot scream as loudly as your distractions. That is why you have to protect it intentionally. The future rarely feels urgent until it becomes regret. By then, it is expensive. So you need to learn how to care about what is not screaming yet. Your health before the crisis. Your money before the emergency. Your relationships before resentment. Your mind before burnout. Your skill before opportunity. Your self-respect before you are completely exhausted from betraying it. That is maturity. Maturity is not waiting for the consequence to become unbearable. Maturity is acting while the consequence is still avoidable. But most people wait until pain becomes louder than comfort. They wait until the body breaks, until the debt grows, until the relationship collapses, until the opportunity passes, until the confidence is gone, until the regret becomes too heavy. Then they say, now I have to change. And yes, sometimes crisis wakes people up. But crisis is an expensive teacher. It teaches, but it charges. A wiser path is to let truth teach you before crisis has to. That means listening when the signs are still quiet. The lack of energy, the constant delay, the promises you no longer believe, the resentment you keep swallowing, the anxiety you keep numbing, the money you keep losing track of, the skill you keep postponing, the future you keep talking about but never practicing for. Those are signs, not final judgments, signs. And signs are gifts if you respond early. But if you ignore them long enough, signs become consequences. That is where many people suffer. They do not suffer only because life was unfair. They suffer because they ignored quiet truth until it became loud pain. And again, this is not about blaming yourself for everything. Some things were not your fault. Some things were truly hard. Some people did hurt you. Some situations were unfair. Some beginnings were harder than others. But healing does not mean pretending you had no responsibility for what happens next. At some point, your pain deserves protection from your own repetition. That sentence is important. Your pain deserves protection from your own repetition. Because sometimes the world hurts you once, and then you keep reopening the wound through the choices you repeat. You return to what breaks you. You stay available to what drains you. You keep feeding the story that keeps you small. You keep using the past as permission to abandon the future. And maybe that started as survival. But survival patterns can become self-betrayal when they continue after they stop protecting you. That is one of the hardest truths. Some of the habits that now hurt you may have once helped you survive. Avoiding conflict may have protected you once. Now it may be destroying your boundaries. Seeking approval may have kept you safe once. Now it may be making you dependent. Staying distracted may have helped you escape pain once. Now it may be stealing your life. Not trusting yourself may have prevented disappointment once. Now it may be preventing growth. So do not hate the old pattern blindly. Ask what it was trying to protect, then ask whether it is still protecting you. Because a pattern can be understandable and still be outdated. A fear can have a history and still not deserve control. A coping mechanism can make sense and still need to be replaced. That is mature self-investment. Not attacking yourself, updating yourself. The old version of you may have been doing the best it could with what it knew. But the future version of you needs more than survival. It needs leadership. From you. Not from motivation, not from a perfect environment, not from someone rescuing you every time discipline becomes uncomfortable. From you. And leadership begins when you stop asking your weakest mood for permission to build your strongest life. Because your weakest mood will almost always say no. It will say later. It will say rest. It will say you are not ready. It will say this is pointless. It will say you already failed. It will say one more day does not matter. But one more day always trains something. One more day of delay trains delay. One more day of avoidance trains avoidance. One more day of truth trains truth. One more day of return trains return. You are always practicing, even when you think nothing is happening. That is why there are no neutral repetitions. Not every day has to be intense. Not every day has to be productive. Not every day has to be a victory. But repeated patterns are never neutral. They move you toward trust or away from it. Toward clarity or away from it. Toward strength or away from it. Toward the future self or away from it. So maybe the question is not, how do I transform my whole life? Maybe the better question is, what am I rehearsing today? Because whatever you rehearse long enough becomes easier to perform. If you rehearse quitting, quitting becomes familiar. If you rehearse returning, returning becomes familiar. If you rehearse panic, panic becomes familiar. If you rehearse patience, patience becomes familiar. If you rehearse self-betrayal, self-betrayal becomes familiar. If you rehearse self-respect, self-respect becomes familiar. And at some point, the rehearsal becomes identity. That is both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying, because it means your small actions are shaping you more than you admit. Hopeful, because it means you are not permanently trapped in the version you practiced before. You can practice differently, but you must begin where the trust was broken. Not where the fantasy looks best, where the trust was broken. Maybe it was broken in your health. You kept saying you would take care of yourself and you did not. Maybe it was broken in money. You kept saying you would be responsible and you avoided looking. Maybe it was broken in relationships. You kept saying you would not accept the same treatment and you returned. Maybe it was broken in work. You kept saying you would build something and you kept waiting for perfect conditions. Maybe it was broken in attention. You kept saying you needed focus, and you kept feeding distraction from morning to night. Find the place where your word became weak. That is the place to start repairing, not with shame, With proof, a small proof, a proof you can repeat, a proof that does not require a perfect day, a proof that survives your real life. Because your real life is the only place change counts. Not the ideal schedule, not the fantasy version of you, not the perfect week. Your real life, with interruptions, with tiredness, with uncertainty, with old patterns, with emotional weather, with responsibilities. If your system only works in a perfect week, it is not a system. It is decoration. You need promises that can survive reality. That is why the first promise should be small. Not because you are small, because the trust is fragile, and fragile trust should not be rebuilt with huge speeches. It should be rebuilt with consistent proof. Think of it like repairing a bridge. You do not drive the heaviest truck over it on the first day. You test it. You reinforce it. You respect the damage. You rebuild structure. Your self-trust deserves the same patience. If you have broken your word to yourself for years, do not try to fix it with one extreme promise. That is often just another form of self-sabotage. You promise too much. You fail. You confirm the old identity, and the cycle repeats. Instead, make the promise small enough that excuses look ridiculous. 10 minutes, 1 page, 1 honest record, 1 message, 1 walk, 1 boundary, 1 focused block, 1 act of cleanup, 1 return. Small enough to do, meaningful enough to count. Then do it, and do it again, and again. Until your mind begins to understand, this is not another emotional performance. Something is different. Not because you shouted, because you stayed. Staying is underrated. Staying with the practice. Staying with the truth. Staying with the repair. Staying after the excitement ends. Staying after the ego gets bored. Staying after nobody applauds. That is where change becomes serious. Because the old version of you expects you to leave. It expects you to disappear. It expects the pattern to win. It expects your promise to expire. So every time you stay a little longer, you weaken the old prediction. That is how you become new, not by declaring a new identity, by making the old prediction less accurate. You used to quit after 3 days. This time you returned on day 4. That matters. You used to hide after a mistake. This time you corrected. That matters. You used to spend when anxious. This time you paused. That matters. You used to answer every message that pulled you back. This time you waited. That matters. You used to say tomorrow. This time you did one thing today. That matters. These moments may look small from the outside, but internally they are evidence against the old story. And once you gather enough evidence against an old story, the story weakens. It loses authority. It stops sounding like truth. It starts sounding like habit. And that is a major breakthrough. Because as long as an old pattern feels like truth, you obey it. When it becomes visible as habit, you can challenge it. Not easily, but honestly. That is why awareness matters. Awareness gives you a small pause between impulse and action. And in that pause, a new life can begin. Not the whole life, just one choice. But one choice repeated becomes a path, and a path repeated becomes a direction. And direction changes destiny more than intensity does. Most people do not need more intensity. They need direction that survives ordinary days. Because ordinary days are where identity is built. Not only in crisis, not only in emotional moments, not only in big decisions, ordinary days, the way you wake up, the way you use the first hour, the way you respond to boredom, the way you handle stress, the way you spend money when no one sees, the way you talk to yourself after failure, the way you choose what gets your attention, the way you return. That is your real training ground. And it is easy to miss because it does not look dramatic. But your future is hidden in your ordinary days. That sentence should make you pause. Your future is hidden in your ordinary days, not in the version of you that appears once a year with a big promise, not in the version that gets inspired at midnight, not in the version that imagines a perfect comeback. In the ordinary version, the one who chooses what to do when nothing feels special. If that version changes, your life changes. If that version stays the same, your dreams stay decorative. So the work is not to create a perfect heroic identity. The work is to upgrade the ordinary version of you. The daily version, the tired version, the tempted version, the bored version, the version that wants to delay, the version that wants to escape, the version that says it does not matter. That version needs training, because that version makes most of your decisions. And that version will not be transformed by one emotional speech. It will be transformed by repeated proof in real conditions. This is where self-respect becomes practical. Self-respect is not just feeling worthy. Self-respect is acting like your life is worth protecting. Protecting your time, protecting your attention, protecting your energy, protecting your body, protecting your money, protecting your peace, protecting your future from the part of you that only wants relief. And sometimes protection looks boring. It looks like going to sleep. It looks like closing the app. It looks like not replying. It looks like cooking instead of ordering. It looks like reading when you wanted noise. It looks like saving when you wanted impulse. It looks like practicing when you wanted to imagine. It looks like returning after failing. It looks like being honest when lying to yourself would feel easier. That is not glamorous. But it is powerful, because every act of self-respect leaves evidence, and evidence is the language your future understands. Your future does not understand promises. It has heard too many. It understands evidence. So give it evidence, not a perfect life. Evidence, not a huge transformation in 1 week. Evidence, not a speech. Evidence, a small proof that you are no longer willing to abandon yourself in the same way. And if you do that long enough, something inside you begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as the person who always quits. You become the person who returns. You stop seeing yourself as the person who has no discipline. You become the person who can keep one promise. You stop seeing yourself as the person who is controlled by every impulse. You become the person who can pause. You stop seeing yourself as the person who is trapped in old patterns. You become the person who can interrupt one. One interruption matters, because a pattern that can be interrupted can be changed. And a person who can change one pattern can eventually change more. That is how the future self starts believing you again. Not because you said, "Trust me," because you showed up. Again and again and again. That is the entire game. Show up enough times to become believable. Not perfect, believable. Because once you become believable to yourself, life feels different. You still have problems, but you do not feel as helpless inside them. You still have fear. But fear does not sound like God anymore. You still have failures, but failure does not automatically become identity. You still have old impulses, but they no longer get unquestioned authority. You still have hard days, but hard days no longer erase the whole path. That is freedom. Quiet freedom. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that looks impressive online. The kind that exists inside your own nervous system when you know you can return to yourself. That is worth more than motivation. That is worth more than a perfect plan. That is worth more than another fantasy of who you might become. Because now you are not fantasizing. You are building proof. And proof is where the future begins to trust you again. And this is where most people misunderstand change. They think change begins when they finally feel powerful. When they wake up with confidence. When they feel clean, ready, strong, organized, and certain. But real change often begins in a much less impressive place. It begins when you are still unsure. Still tired, still embarrassed by how many times you said the same thing before, still surrounded by the same triggers, still hearing the same old voice in your head, still feeling the pull of the version of you that has won so many times. And you act anyway, not because you feel transformed, but because you are tired of letting the old version decide everything. That is the turning point. Not when the old pattern disappears. When the old pattern speaks and you no longer obey immediately. That pause matters. A pause can save a life, not always in a dramatic way. Sometimes it saves the life you are trying to build. The pause before spending money you do not need to spend. The pause before answering someone who always drags you back into chaos. The pause before opening the same app for the 100th time. The pause before saying, "I will start tomorrow." The pause before turning one bad moment into a ruined day. The pause before believing the same old sentence about yourself. That pause is where your future gets a chance to speak. Because the old version is loud. It speaks quickly. It knows your emotional shortcuts. It says, "Just this once." It says, "You already failed." It says, "You deserve comfort." It says, "This does not matter." It says, "You can fix it later." And if you have obeyed that voice for years, it feels natural. But natural does not always mean true. Sometimes natural only means repeated. That distinction is everything. A thought can feel true because you have rehearsed it too often. An excuse can feel wise because you have used it too long. A fear can feel like identity because it has been sitting in your mind for years. But repetition is not proof. Familiarity is not truth. And comfort is not always safety. Sometimes comfort is just the old pattern trying to survive. So the work is not to wait until the old voice disappears. The work is to hear it and choose differently. Even once, especially once. Because the first time you choose differently, something changes. Not everything, but something. You create a contradiction, a crack in the old story. The old story says you always quit, but you returned. The old story says you cannot focus, but you stayed for 20 minutes. The old story says you have no control, but you paused before reacting. The old story says you always go back, but this time you did not. That contradiction is powerful, because the mind that learned one identity through evidence can learn another identity through evidence too. But it needs evidence, not a speech, not a fantasy, not an emotional promise. Evidence. That is why the next stage of self-investment is not inspiration. It is repair. You repair the contract with yourself. And repair is not glamorous. Repair is slow. Repair is repetitive. Repair often looks smaller than the damage. If you have spent years abandoning your own word, one good day will not fix everything. But one good day can begin the repair. Then another. Then another. And eventually the mind begins to ask a new question. Maybe this time is different. That question is fragile. Protect it. Do not try to prove everything at once. Do not use one burst of motivation to create a plan so extreme that failure becomes almost guaranteed. That is another form of self-betrayal. You get excited. You create a perfect routine. You promise too much. You imagine a completely new life. And then your real life arrives. Fatigue arrives. Work arrives. Stress arrives. Boredom arrives. Old emotions arrive. A bad night arrives. A criticism arrives. A temptation arrives. And the perfect routine collapses. Then the old story returns stronger. See? You never change. But maybe the problem was not that you cannot change. Maybe the promise was built for an imaginary version of you, not the real one. A real promise has to survive real life. That means it must be clear, small enough to repeat, specific enough to measure, important enough to matter, and honest enough that you cannot hide from it. Do not promise, I will completely change my life. Promise something your behavior can prove. I will protect 20 minutes. I will write down every expense today. I will walk before I scroll. I will practice one skill before I consume entertainment. I will return after failing. I will not use a bad morning as permission to waste the whole day. I will not say yes when my body already knows it is a no. That kind of promise may sound small, but small promises are where credibility is rebuilt. Because your mind does not trust size, it trusts consistency. It does not believe the biggest promise. It believes the promise that survives. And this is why many people who are capable still feel weak. They keep choosing promises designed to impress their emotions instead of promises designed to rebuild trust. They say, from now on, everything changes, but everything does not change. So nothing changes. They say, I will never do that again. Then they do it again. They say, starting Monday, I become a different person. But Monday is not a personality transplant. It is just a day where the same patterns arrive unless you have built a different response. So stop worshiping the dramatic restart. The dramatic restart often gives you the feeling of change without the structure of change. It gives you a rush, a story, a clean beginning. But if the system underneath remains the same, the old identity will win again. Not because it is stronger forever, because it has more practice. The old identity has repetitions. It has shortcuts. It has emotional rewards. It has familiar environments. It has people who know how to activate it. It has a whole inner language. The new identity has almost nothing at first, just a decision, a few actions, a fragile hope, a small proof. So protect the small proof. Treat it like the beginning of something. Because it is. A person who has not trusted themselves for years should not despise the first honest evidence. That evidence is precious. It is the first stone of the bridge back to yourself. And yes, that bridge will take time. You will not repair self-trust overnight. But you can damage it today or repair it today. That choice appears again and again, in ordinary moments. And ordinary moments are where the real work lives. There is a strange arrogance in waiting for big moments, as if life is only shaped by dramatic decisions. But most lives are shaped by ordinary repetitions. What you do when you are bored, what you do when you are anxious, what you do when nobody expects anything from you, what you do when you could get away with abandoning yourself, what you do when the excuse sounds reasonable, what you do when the comfort is available. That is where identity forms, not in the version of you that gives powerful speeches in your head, in the version of you that handles a normal Tuesday. If that version changes, your life changes, because that version is the one who actually lives your life. The inspired version visits. The daily version stays, so train the daily version. Do not build a plan that only your inspired self can follow. Build a plan your daily self can respect. The tired self, the busy self, the tempted self, the emotional self, the imperfect self, the self that still has responsibilities, history, triggers, and limits. That is not lowering the standard. That is making the standard real. A real standard can be practiced. A fantasy standard can only be admired. And admiration does not change identity. Practice does. This is why the question must become, what can I practice even when I do not feel like becoming a new person? That is a serious question. Because some days you will not feel like becoming a new person. Some days you will want the old escape. Some days your future will feel too far away to matter. Some days the old pattern will feel warm. Some days discipline will feel like loss. Some days truth will feel like pressure. Some days comfort will feel like the only thing that understands you. And on those days, you need something stronger than mood. You need a promise you can keep, a reason you can remember, a system that reduces negotiation, and a willingness to return fast when you do not keep it perfectly. Fast return is more important than perfect performance. Listen to that carefully. Fast return is more important than perfect performance. Because perfection makes people fragile. The moment they fall, they think everything is over. But return makes people durable. They fall and they come back. They lose a day, and they do not lose the week. They miss the mark, and they do not destroy the identity. They make a bad choice, and they do not use shame as an excuse to keep choosing badly. That is how real people change. Not cleanly, not perfectly, but with shorter gaps between falling and returning. At first, maybe you return after a month, then after a week, then after a day, then after an hour, then after one breath. That is progress. Not because you never struggle, because struggle no longer owns you for as long. That is a powerful measure. How long does the old pattern keep you after it catches you? A year? A month? A week? A day? An hour? A moment? Growth often looks like reducing the amount of time you remain captured. You may still feel the pull, but you do not live there as long. You may still fall, but you do not build a house in the fall. You may still doubt yourself, but you do not let doubt write the whole story. That is not weakness. That is repair. And repair creates dignity, a quiet dignity. The dignity of someone who stopped pretending change is impossible. The dignity of someone who stopped waiting to feel perfect. The dignity of someone who can look at their own inconsistency without turning it into self-hatred. The dignity of someone who says, I see the pattern, and I am going to practice another one. That sentence is enough to begin. Not because it is magical, because it is honest. And honesty is the first clean material you can build with. A life built on self-deception always stays unstable. You can decorate it. You can perform confidence. You can talk about goals. You can consume deep content. You can post powerful quotes. But if the truth underneath is avoided, the structure shakes. So tell the truth. Where are you breaking your word? Where are you pretending you do not know? Where are you calling fear being realistic? Where are you calling avoidance rest? Where are you calling delay timing? Where are you calling self-abandonment being easygoing? Where are you calling chaos personality? Where are you calling a cage comfort? These questions are not meant to destroy you. They are meant to locate you. Because you cannot leave a place you refuse to name, and you cannot repair what you keep defending. There is no shame in finding the pattern. The shame would be seeing it clearly and choosing to keep feeding it forever. But even that shame is not useful if it only paralyzes you. Use truth as a tool, not a weapon. A weapon makes you bleed. A tool helps you build. So when you see the pattern, do not say, I am hopeless. Say, this is the place where proof is needed. That changes everything. The problem becomes a construction site, not a grave. If you notice that you always delay difficult tasks, that is where proof is needed. If you notice that you spend when you feel empty, that is where proof is needed. If you notice that you break your boundaries for approval, that is where proof is needed. If you notice that you disappear after failure, that is where proof is needed. If you notice that your attention is no longer yours, that is where proof is needed. Not massive proof. Consistent proof. Small enough to repeat, serious enough to matter. That is the formula. Small enough to repeat, serious enough to matter. If it is too small to matter, it becomes symbolic but weak. If it is too big to repeat, it becomes emotional but unstable. You need the middle, a promise that touches real life, a promise that can be done today, a promise that makes hiding harder, a promise that gives your mind a new memory. For example, if your attention is broken, do not begin with 12 hours of perfect focus. Begin with one protected block. No phone, no noise, one task. 20 minutes. Then finish. That is proof. If your money feels chaotic, do not begin by promising financial perfection. Begin by writing down what you spend today. No judgment, no story, just truth. That is proof. If your body feels abandoned, do not begin by punishing it. Begin by moving it. Walking, stretching, training lightly, sleeping better, feeding it like it belongs to someone you are responsible for. That is proof. If your boundaries are weak, do not begin with a dramatic speech. Begin with one clean no. No over-explaining. No apology that cancels the boundary. No emotional negotiation with someone committed to getting access to you. That is proof. If your dream has been a fantasy, do not begin by redesigning the whole dream again. Begin by producing one piece of work. One page, one recording, one outline, one practice session, one visible step. That is proof. The proof must enter reality. If it stays in your head, the old identity remains safe. Reality is where identity is tested. And yes, reality is messy. You may discover that you are less disciplined than you thought. Good. Now you know where to train. You may discover that your plan was vague. Good. Now you can make it concrete. You may discover that your environment is stronger than your intention. Good. Now you can redesign the environment. You may discover that you rely too much on emotion. Good. Now you can build structure. Truth is not the enemy. Truth is the map. But people avoid the map because they do not like where they are. That is understandable. But avoiding the map does not move you. It just keeps you lost with more pride. Let yourself be located. There is relief in finally knowing where you are, even if you do not like it. Because once you know where you are, you can stop pretending that the road begins somewhere else. It begins here, with this body, this mind, this history, this schedule, this fear, this level of energy, this amount of money, this current ability, this imperfect environment, this real life, not the life you wish you had before starting. This one, and that may be uncomfortable, but it is also powerful. Because if change can begin here, then you do not need to wait for an imaginary version of life. You can begin in the actual one. That is where your future self starts watching differently. Not when you make a dramatic promise, when you begin in the real conditions. Because that is the first sign that you are no longer performing change. You are practicing it. Performance wants to look clean. Practice is willing to look messy. Performance wants applause. Practice wants evidence. Performance wants to be seen as changed. Practice becomes changed. Choose practice, even when it is boring. Especially when it is boring. Because boredom is where many people lose their future. Not tragedy. Boredom. They cannot tolerate the ordinary repetition required to become good. They cannot tolerate the quiet stage. They cannot tolerate doing something valuable without immediate stimulation. They cannot tolerate the lack of applause. So they return to noise, and noise gives them relief. But noise does not give them depth. Noise does not give them skill. Noise does not give them self-trust. Noise does not give them a future that believes them. If you want that future, you will have to make peace with repetition. Not every meaningful thing will entertain you. Some meaningful things will train you. And training is often repetitive before it becomes rewarding. That is true in the body, true in money, true in relationships, true in learning, true in emotional control, true in creativity, true in discipline. The beginning often feels plain, but plain does not mean useless. A foundation is plain. A foundation is not beautiful. People do not take pictures of foundations with the same excitement as finished buildings. But everything depends on them. Your private repetitions are foundation work. Your small promises are foundation work. Your early returns after failure are foundation work. Your honest records are foundation work. Your protected attention is foundation work. And if you despise foundation work, you will keep building identities that collapse under pressure. That is what happens when people chase the image before the structure. They want the label before the life. They want to be called disciplined before they practice discipline. They want to be seen as successful before they can handle success. They want to look peaceful before they stop feeding chaos. They want to look confident before they rebuild self-trust. But labels without structure become pressure. The world may believe the image for a while, but your nervous system knows, your private behavior knows, your unfinished promises know. And eventually, the gap between image and evidence becomes exhausting. That is why it is better to build quietly. Not secretly from shame, quietly from seriousness. Let the proof grow before you demand recognition. Let the identity root before you explain it. Let the new pattern gain strength before you expose it to every opinion. Because early change is delicate. If you show it to the wrong people too early, they may treat it like a debate. They may question it, mock it, pull it into old dynamics, make you explain what you barely know how to protect. Not everyone deserves access to the beginning of your repair. Some things need privacy. Some things need silence. Some things need to grow away from people who only know how to relate to your old self. This is not arrogance. It is protection. A seed is not weak because it needs soil. It is alive. Your new identity may need soil too. An environment where the first proof can survive. That may mean changing what you consume, changing who gets your attention, changing the first hour of your day, changing what you do after stress, changing what you allow into your mind at night, changing how quickly you say yes, changing how often you explain yourself, changing where your phone sleeps. Small environmental changes can protect large identity changes. Because again, this is not only about willpower. Willpower is real, but willpower without design gets tired. If every day requires you to fight the same easy temptations in the same way, eventually the temptations win. So make the old pattern less convenient. Make the new pattern more visible. Do not rely on heroic emotion. Rely on intelligent design. If the phone steals your mornings, move it. If an app steals your focus, block it. If a person pulls you into chaos, create distance. If spending becomes emotional anesthesia, add friction before purchase. If you forget your promise, place it where your day will see it. If you always fail at night, make the evening simpler. If you always abandon after missing one day, write the return rule before you need it. The return rule is important. Decide now how you will return when you fail. Not if. When? Because failure will come. And if you have no return rule, the old identity will write one for you. Its rule will be, disappear. Start over next week. Feel ashamed. Destroy the rest of the day. Use the failure as proof. Go back to the old pattern. So write a better rule. If I miss once, I return the same day. If I cannot do the full version, I do the smallest version. If I fail, I record what happened without insulting myself. If I fall into the old pattern, I do one action that reconnects me to the new one. If I feel shame, I do not let shame become another excuse. That kind of rule protects you from emotional collapse. And emotional collapse is where many changes die. Not at the first mistake, at the interpretation of the mistake. One person misses one day and says, I am done. Another person misses one day and says, back tomorrow. Same mistake, different identity. The mistake matters, but the interpretation matters more. Your interpretation either returns you to the path or hands you back to the pattern. So be careful with the story you tell after failure. Do not lie, do not minimize, do not pretend it did not matter, but do not turn it into a weapon. Say the truth cleanly. I broke the promise. I see what happened. This is the trigger. This is the correction. This is the next proof. Then move. That is how adults rebuild trust. Not through dramatic self-hatred, through clean responsibility. Clean responsibility is powerful because it does not waste energy defending ego. It does not need to prove innocence. It does not need to perform victimhood. It simply asks, what is mine to correct? That question will save you years. What is mine to correct? Not, how do I blame myself for everything? Not, how do I blame everyone else? What is mine to correct? Maybe not the whole situation. Maybe not the past. Maybe not what someone did. Maybe not the system. Maybe not the unfairness. But something. Your response. Your preparation. Your boundary. Your attention. Your next repetition. Your environment. Your honesty. Your return. That something is the doorway. And if you keep refusing the doorway because it is not the whole house, you stay outside. Take the doorway. Start with your part. Your part may be smaller than you wish, but it is real, and real is enough to begin. This is where the future self stops being a fantasy. It becomes a relationship, not a magical future person waiting far away. A relationship with the version of you that receives the consequences of today. That version will inherit your habits, your health, your money decisions, your unfinished work, your avoided conversations, your protected attention, your practiced skills, your broken promises, your kept promises. You are sending something forward every day. The question is whether you are sending help or damage. That is not meant to scare you. It is meant to make today matter. Because today is not isolated. Today becomes material. For trust or distrust, for clarity or confusion, for strength or dependence, for freedom or regret. You do not need to obsess over the future. But you should stop acting like the future is someone else's problem. It is not. It is you. Later, receiving what you practiced. So when you say, tomorrow, understand what you are doing. Sometimes tomorrow is reasonable. Sometimes rest is necessary. Sometimes postponement is strategic. But many times, tomorrow is the old version protecting itself. Tomorrow is where promises go to avoid being tested. Tomorrow is clean. Tomorrow has no friction. Tomorrow has no tired body. Tomorrow has no temptation. Tomorrow has no awkward first step. Tomorrow has no evidence. That is why tomorrow feels so safe. But a life cannot be built inside tomorrow. It can only be built when tomorrow becomes today. And today is always messier. That is why today matters. Today is where your word becomes real or weak. Today is where the future self watches. Today is where the old pattern either wins automatically or gets interrupted. Today is where proof can begin. Not perfect proof. Real proof. So do not wait until you feel like a different person. Act once in a way that gives a different person evidence. That is enough for today. Then tomorrow do it again. Not because one action changes everything. Because one action can begin changing the story. And a changed story, backed by repeated proof, becomes identity. That is the work. Not glamorous, not easy, but deeply powerful. And that is where most people underestimate themselves. Not because they think too small in their dreams. Sometimes they dream very big. They imagine the better body, the better mind, the better income, the better relationship, the better routine, the better version of themselves. They imagine peace. They imagine confidence. They imagine respect. They imagine freedom. But they underestimate the power of one honest action repeated long enough. They think transformation has to feel massive. They think if the step is small, it cannot matter. They think if nobody sees it, it does not count. They think if it does not change everything immediately, it failed. But your mind is not only changed by massive events, it is changed by repeated evidence, quiet evidence, private evidence, evidence that you are no longer completely ruled by the old script. And sometimes the first sign of a new life is not excitement. It is a strange calm. The calm of doing what you said you would do. The calm of not negotiating for an hour. The calm of choosing one difficult thing without turning it into a performance. The calm of returning after failure instead of creating a tragedy around it. The calm of realizing that you are not fixed forever in the identity you practiced before. That calm is powerful because it means your internal world is starting to trust your behavior. And when that happens, life feels different. Not easy. Different. You still have problems. You still have pressure. You still have fear. You still have temptation. You still have old patterns trying to return. But now there is another voice inside you. Not the loud motivational voice. Not the fake confidence voice. A quieter one. The voice that says, "We have evidence now." That voice matters. Because when you have evidence, you do not need to argue with yourself as much. You know you can return. You know you can keep something small. You know you can survive discomfort. You know you can interrupt a pattern. You know you can choose before you feel ready. And that knowledge changes the weight of the next decision. The next promise does not feel as impossible. The next boundary does not feel as foreign. The next return does not feel as humiliating. The next hard day does not feel like the end of the path. That is how strength grows. Not by eliminating weakness. By proving that weakness is not the only thing inside you. You may still be afraid, but now you also have evidence of courage. You may still feel distracted, but now you also have evidence of focus. You may still feel inconsistent, but now you also have evidence of return. You may still feel uncertain, but now you also have evidence that uncertainty does not have to stop you. This is why proof is more powerful than positive thinking. Positive thinking tries to convince the mind. Proof gives the mind something to stand on. And a mind with something to stand on does not collapse as easily. So stop asking yourself to believe in a version of you that has no evidence yet. Build the evidence, then belief will have somewhere to land. That is a more honest path. Because telling yourself, "I am disciplined," while breaking every promise may only create more inner conflict. But keeping one promise, then another, begins to make discipline believable. Telling yourself, "I am confident," while avoiding every challenge may not reach the deeper part of you. But facing one uncomfortable action and surviving it gives confidence something real to attach to. Telling yourself, "I am changing," while repeating the same pattern every day can become emotional theater. But interrupting the pattern once gives change a starting point. The body believes repetition. The mind believes evidence. The future believes behavior. So give them behavior, not perfect behavior. Consistent enough behavior, honest enough behavior. Behavior that says, "I am not only the person I was yesterday." That sentence does not need to be dramatic. It needs to be true. And truth becomes true through action. This is where your future self enters the conversation again. Because the future version of you is not waiting for your words. It has heard your words. It is waiting for your pattern. It is watching whether you keep sending the same consequences forward, the same tiredness, the same chaos, the same delay, the same unfinished promises, the same emotional spending, the same lack of boundaries, the same distracted mornings, the same nights of escape, the same excuses with better vocabulary, or whether you finally send something different, a protected hour, a completed task, a cleaner boundary, a calmer response, a recorded expense, a skill practiced badly but honestly, a return after falling, a choice that says, I am done making my future pay for my weakest mood. That is a serious sentence. I am done making my future pay for my weakest mood. Because that is what many people do. They let a temporary mood create long-term consequences. They let a moment of anxiety spend money the future needed. They let a moment of loneliness reopen a relationship that the future will suffer from. They let a moment of boredom destroy the attention the future requires. They let a moment of shame turn one mistake into a long disappearance. They let a moment of comfort delay the skill that could change everything. And then the future receives the bill. Not because the future deserved it, because the present refused to lead. That is why leadership over yourself matters, not domination, not cruelty. Leadership. A leader does not ask the most frightened part of the group to make every decision. A leader listens. A leader understands fear. A leader respects exhaustion. But a leader does not hand the entire direction to panic, impulse, or comfort. You need that kind of leadership inside yourself. You can listen to the tired part of you without letting it destroy the plan. You can listen to the afraid part of you without letting it cancel the future. You can listen to the wounded part of you without letting it choose every relationship. You can listen to the impulsive part of you without giving it your money, your time, your attention, and your peace. That is inner leadership. And inner leadership is built through small decisions where you prove that no single mood owns the whole life. You can be tired and still do the small version. You can be afraid and still tell the truth. You can be ashamed and still return. You can be tempted and still pause. You can be uncertain and still begin. You can be hurt and still not betray yourself again. That is not perfection. That is leadership. And when leadership appears, your life starts to reorganize around a stronger center. The chaos does not vanish, but it stops being the only force. The old pattern does not vanish, but it stops being unquestioned. The fear does not vanish, but it stops being king. The comfort does not vanish, but it stops being God. And that changes the direction of everything. Because once you stop letting the weakest mood govern the whole life, you begin to recover choice. And choice is the beginning of freedom. Not unlimited choice, not fantasy freedom, real freedom. The freedom to not obey every impulse, the freedom to protect your attention, the freedom to return after failure, the freedom to say no without turning it into a trial, the freedom to build while still afraid, the freedom to disappoint an old pattern, the freedom to become less predictable to the version of you that kept winning. That last one is important. Become less predictable to your old self. Your old self expects you to delay. Surprise it. Your old self expects you to disappear after failure. Return. Your old self expects you to say yes for approval. Pause. Your old self expects you to use stress as permission. Choose one clean action. Your old self expects tomorrow. Do something today. Not everything. Something. Because something done today is stronger than a perfect life imagined for later. The old version of you is not defeated by hatred. It is weakened by repeated contradiction. You contradict it every time you keep your word. You contradict it every time you return quickly. You contradict it every time you choose proof over performance. You contradict it every time you stop turning discomfort into surrender. And enough contradiction becomes a new identity. Not instantly, but eventually. That is how the person you say you want to become starts becoming believable. At first, that person is only an idea. Then that person becomes a few choices. Then a few choices become a pattern. Then the pattern becomes evidence. Then evidence becomes trust. Then trust becomes identity. And one day, what used to feel impossible starts to feel normal. Not easy. Normal. You no longer need to make a huge emotional event out of the basic things that protect your life. You do them because they are who you are becoming. That is when change is no longer just a project. It becomes a relationship with yourself. A relationship where your word matters. A relationship where your future is included. A relationship where your pain is not used as an excuse to keep hurting yourself. A relationship where your mistakes are corrected instead of worshipped. A relationship where your ordinary days are respected because you understand what they are building. And that relationship may be the most important result of all. Because you can achieve many things while still not trusting yourself. You can look successful and still be internally divided. You can receive applause and still know your private life is unstable. You can build an image and still feel like your real self is not safe with you. But when you become someone you can trust, even before everything changes externally, something deep begins to settle. You become less desperate for validation, less addicted to noise, less willing to negotiate with what destroys you, less impressed by empty intensity, less afraid of slow progress, because you know the process now. You know that proof takes time. You know that identity needs repetition. You know that trust is rebuilt privately before it becomes visible publicly. And you know that the future does not need you to become perfect today. It needs you to stop disappearing. That may be the whole message. Stop disappearing. Stop disappearing after one mistake. Stop disappearing after one uncomfortable truth. Stop disappearing when the work becomes boring. Stop disappearing when nobody praises you. Stop disappearing when the old comfort calls your name. Stop disappearing from your own life and then wondering why you feel abandoned. Because sometimes the abandonment you feel is not only what others did. Sometimes it is the echo of the places where you left yourself. That is a hard thing to admit, but it can also be the beginning of repair. Because if you left yourself in certain places, you can begin returning to yourself in those places. Return to your body. Return to your attention. Return to your word. Return to your work. Return to your boundaries. Return to your unfinished dream. Return to the part of you that still knows you were meant to participate in your own life. Not as a spectator. Not as someone waiting to be rescued by a perfect mood. Not as someone who only speaks about potential. As someone who proves something. Small. Real. Repeated. That is enough. Do not make this complicated just to avoid doing it. The mind loves complexity when it wants to escape action. It asks for the perfect method, the perfect routine, the perfect explanation, the perfect timing, the perfect emotional state. But maybe you do not need perfect. Maybe you need honest. Honest is simpler. Honest says, I know the next thing. Maybe not the whole path, but the next thing. And if you do not know the next thing, then the next thing is to tell the truth until it becomes clear. What are you avoiding? What are you repeating? What are you calling rest? What are you calling timing? What are you calling personality? What are you calling love? What are you calling loyalty? What are you calling fear? What are you calling impossible? Somewhere inside those answers is the place where self-trust broke. And that is where proof must begin. Do not begin where it looks impressive. Begin where it is honest. If the honest place is money, begin there. If it is health, begin there. If it is attention, begin there. If it is a relationship, begin there. If it is a skill, begin there. If it is the way you speak to yourself after failure, begin there. If it is the fact that you keep promising and not acting, begin there. And make the first proof so real that even your doubt has to notice it. That is the standard, not huge. Real, because real proof is heavier than a huge fantasy. A fantasy can disappear as soon as the mood changes. Real proof stays in your memory. It becomes part of your internal record. And your internal record is what your self-trust reads. So write something different into it. Today, not as a performance, as repair. If you need to walk, walk. If you need to write, write. If you need to track, track. If you need to apologize, apologize. If you need to stop replying, stop. If you need to sleep, sleep. If you need to practice, practice. If you need to return, return. But do not just think about the person you want to become. Give that person evidence, because without evidence, the future self remains a stranger. With evidence, it becomes familiar, and eventually, it becomes you. That is the quiet miracle of repetition. You practice something long enough, and one day it stops feeling like an act. It becomes a home, but choose carefully what you let become home. Because some people have made a home out of anxiety, a home out of delay, a home out of self-doubt, a home out of chaos, a home out of broken promises, a home out of almost changing. And almost changing may be one of the most dangerous homes of all. Because it feels close to transformation. It gives you the emotion of progress. It gives you the identity of someone who understands. It lets you say, I know. But knowing is not changing. Almost starting is not starting. Almost returning is not returning. Almost protecting your future still leaves it exposed. Be careful with almost. Almost can steal years while making you feel like you are about to begin. So begin. Not perfectly, not loudly, not someday. Begin in a way that creates proof. And when you fail, return. And when you return, continue. And when it gets boring, remember that boring repetition may be rebuilding something your dramatic promises never could. And when nobody notices, remember that self-trust notices. And when the old voice says, "This does not matter," remember that the old voice survives by making small things look meaningless. But small things are not meaningless when they are repeated. A small betrayal repeated can damage a life. A small proof repeated can rebuild one. That is the final contrast. Every day, you are teaching yourself who you are. Not only through what you want, through what you do after wanting, through what you do after failing, through what you do after understanding, through what you do when nobody is watching, through what you do when the old pattern offers comfort, through what you do when your future has no immediate reward to give you. That is where identity is trained. And one day, your life will show what you trained. Your attention will show it. Your energy will show it. Your confidence will show it. Your relationships will show it. Your money will show it. Your work will show it. Your peace will show it. Your ability to return will show it. Your future will not ask how many promises you made. It will live inside the results of the ones you kept. So keep one. Start there. Keep one promise small enough to repeat and serious enough to matter. Then keep another. Then return when you fail. Then protect the proof. Then stop performing change and start practicing it. Because your future does not need another speech. It does not need another emotional declaration at midnight. It does not need another perfect plan that collapses on a normal day. It needs proof that you are becoming someone it can trust. And that proof begins with the next repetition, the next honest action, the next return, the next time you choose not to disappear. So ask yourself, without drama and without lying, what would I do today if I wanted my future to believe me again? Not what would I say, what would I do? That is the question, and the answer is probably smaller than your ego wants, but more powerful than your excuses can survive. Do that, then do it again, and let the person you are becoming finally have evidence that you did not abandon them.